We are very fortunate today to have a couple folks join us to share some amazing stories. The first, our guest featured today is Mr. Rudy Horowitz, and our other guest is Alyssa Messer, who will introduce him. We are very lucky to have them here today, so please give them your full attention as we hear Mr. Horowitz's story.
Thank you, Phil. Good morning, everyone. It was the morning of the 3rd of September, 1939. As we were packing for our trip, we heard a great commotion in the street below. The news had just come over the radio that England and France had declared war on Germany. The atmosphere of gloom turned to instant jubilation. People were laughing, congratulating each other, hugging and kissing strangers in the street. For sure, the war would be over in a matter of days with the total collapse of the Nazi forces. Our plans as a family remained unchanged as Father escorted us with our luggage to the train station to catch a train for Lublin. Lublin? Did I pronounce that correct? Okay. As we settled in our compartment, Oscar and I grabbed 2 seats close to the window. I then pulled on a leather strap, which lowers the window so I could lean out and observe the commotion and activities on the platform below us. Immediately opposite our track, there was a train with a mixture of passenger cars and freight cars. The passenger cars were filled with officers, and the freight cars were filled with enlisted men. The soldiers were all laughing and singing and joking about giving it to the Germans. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt a tremendous blast of air, accompanied by an ear-shattering explosion. It knocked me off my feet, and I landed in my mother's lap. I then realized that the drone of plane engines preceded an explosion. There were explosions all around us. The Nazi dive bombers were after the troop train that had just passed by, and we found ourselves in the middle of an air raid. Someone yelled, "Everyone get off the train!" Mother grabbed us by hand and we rushed for the exit. Most of the other compartments, as well as the corridor, were filled with wounded women and children bleeding profusely. The blast of explosions blew out all the windows of the compartments, where the windows remained shut and shards of glass became deadly projectiles, killing and wounding anyone that was in their paths. Running and stepping over the casualties and through the pools of blood, we got off the train and rushed downstairs to the underground passage between the train platforms. The space was jammed with humanity, mainly women and children, covered in blood, screaming and praying. The bombs kept raining down what seemed like an insurmountable time, though it was probably no longer than 15 minutes. With each explosion, Mother grabbed our heads, pulling us towards her, shielding us beneath her body. If we had a moment of silence for every Holocaust victim, we would be silent for 11 and a half years. Think about that. If we had a moment of silence, a minute, for every Holocaust victim, we would be silent for 11 and a half years. You have the distinct privilege today to hear a life story of a remarkable man. Now, I'd like to tell you that Mr. Horowitz, this is one aspect of his life. He's a very loving grandfather. That's how I came to know him, through his grandchildren at Raymond Elementary School, where my children go. He's a loving father, whose children are here today. Some, his daughter's not. He's a remarkable architect in his accomplished career. He's a creative baker. I could list on and on and on. This is one aspect of his story. But you have the privilege to bear witness to this great story, and I hope that you listen with great attention and that you walk out of here changed in a more compassionate world. Mr. Horowitz?
Thank you very much, Alyssa. And I really thank you. Nobody has so far, until now, read my story as well and as vividly as you have. I'm afraid I won't be able to follow up as well when I read it. You really put some feeling into it. Thank you very, very much. One thing that I'd like to add is that the part of the story that Alyssa read was 1939, when I was only 10 years old. When the war ended, which was not for us, was 1944. I was 15 years old. So just give me let me tell you how the book came about. As Alyssa said, you know, I'm an architect, and I never thought of writing a book. But when my first grandson was born, Oscar, who's named after my late brother, who's in the book, when he was born 9 years ago, his birthday will be next week, I thought of, you know, being that I was approaching 80 years of age, that he would never hear my story unless I left something tangible. So I decided to write the book. And since I never wrote a book, I had no idea how to go about it. So I decided to write it in the form of letters. And these letters were written contemporaneously from that time to my future grandchildren, meaning that I tried to write it in such a way that, say, when I was 10 years old, I tried to put it in the language of a 10-year-old and so on and so forth until I reached teenage years, you know, and eventually, you know, the age of 20 when I arrived in the United States as an immigrant and refugee from Europe. And the book covers 10 years of my life from 1939 to 1949. So I would like to read you another letter, or part of a letter. And the date is September 10th, 1941. And it starts, Dear Oscar and Emma, recent events, most of them unpleasant, prevented me from writing sooner. Never mind that referring to what the Nazis are doing to us, as unpleasantness is the height of understatement. I'll bring you up to date presently, but first I want to share the latest indignity, which befell us this week. Starting last Monday, all Jews from the age of 6, mind you, must wear a yellow Star of David with the word Jude, meaning Jew, on their left breast. The stars are printed on cheap yellow muslin sheets in an interlocking pattern and are distributed to the Judenrat office. After cutting them apart with scissors, each must be sewn on securely to garments intended for outdoor wear. And here is, I'll just illustrate so you can see what this looks like. This is what the star looked like. And I put some two-faced tape, so just to make it somewhat more realistic, I'll put it on. This is how it was worn. And I've made several copies, certainly not 200 to accommodate you all, but there may be a couple of dozen, which Alyssa has, and she'll pass out whoever wants to get into the mood and wear it for the duration of this. Not that I think this would really make it exactly what it was like, but you might try and see what it's like. Thus Oscar and I, who were hitherto exempt from wearing the white armband with the Star of David, will now carry with us this badge wherever we go. The word Jude is spelled in a mock Hebrew font. Is this the Nazi sense of humor? Additionally, all males must add the middle name Israel to their ID cards. All women must add the middle name Sarah. I'm now Rudolph Israel Horowitz. Mother, along with many other unfortunate, is trying to defy and outsmart the Germans in whatever small way is possible. In response to directive that all fur coats have to be turned in, she had her fur turned inside out and altered so that it looks like an ordinary winter coat with the fur concealed in the lining. When they demanded that all ski boots be turned in for the use of the Wehrmacht, Wehrmacht is the German army, she had the ski boots altered by a shoemaker so that the distinguishing square toe, which fit into bear strap binding, was rounded on a shoe last. Now Oscar and I each have a pair of hiking boots. Early in the spring, the Central Jewish Committee assisted the Germans in organizing workshops of various trades in the ghetto. the committee sent out appeals to the tradesmen and craftsmen to join these workshops and thus be saved from deportation. The first shop organized by a German entrepreneur from Berlin, Hans Held, eager to profit from cheap labor, employs tailors who turn out military uniforms and various other articles of clothing. It was followed by Schwedler's shop, which manufactured leather goods, principally rucksacks for the military. By this time, Oscar and I, unencumbered by the slow progress in a conventional public school, completed 3 years of instruction with our tutor, and we were far ahead of other kids our age. Mother dismissed the tutor, though we are still continuing with our English lessons. You know, Jews were not allowed to go to school. They closed all the schools that were attended by Jews, so people, youngsters either didn't go to school or, like my mother, hired some tutors who were seniors in high school to teach them and bring them up to snuff. That's what my mother did. Early in June, Mrs. Jaworska, a dairy farm lady, offered to take Oscar and myself to her farm for a couple of weeks to fatten us up with decent peasant fare and let us breathe some fresh country air. Though it was risky, Mother consented, and off we went to the farm. Our stay there brought back memories of the carefree pre-war summers we spent on the farm. Unfortunately, we had to return home after a week. The Germans had just invaded the Soviet Union, and all the military traffic going through the village on the way east made Mrs. Jaworska very nervous, and she brought us back to our hometown, Sosnowiec. Like some of the children over the age of 12, we went to work in the shops. Oscar was hired by Schwedler leather shop and learned how to mend leather backpacks. I had the good fortune to work in an art shop which was owned by a German woman related to Schwedler. It is a small enterprise employing about 50 people. I'm the only child working there. The shop turns out decorative designs, mainly flowers, on ceramic tiles, which are sold as wall hangings. My job is to fill in flower petals on the tile designs with a small paintbrush, matching the colors on an approved sample. I work with 20 or 25 tiles in front of me, all linked with the outlines all lined with the outlines of flowers, mixing a color for each petal and filling them in one at a time on all the tiles. When one petal is complete, I mix the paint for the next part, and so on, painting, shadings, etc., etc. For my efforts, I am paid the meager sum of 14 marks per month. Another popular product is aphorism, carefully lettered in Gothic font on varnished wooden plaques. Though I can't do the calligraphy myself, I memorized one of such aphorism in particular because of its raunchy content. And here it is in German. I could read it to you in German, but I actually translated it freely into English, and while it contains some naughty words, I will substitute them accordingly. So this aphorism goes as follows. So another day ends with a snap, and all we have made is more crap. So lay down your sorrow, kiss my blank until tomorrow, and tomorrow, with the same grit, right back into the same blank. Though a teenager trapped by fate and the Nazis in the ghetto, I'm not immune from snickering at dirty language. It is now becoming increasingly clear why the Wachtels, along with other Jews from Oświęcim, were moved to Sosnowiec, which is our hometown, surrounding communities. Rumors about a huge concentration camp which is taking shape in Oświęcim, which is Auschwitz, for the principal purpose of exterminating the Jews. The camp is purported to be complete with gas chambers and crematoria intended to accomplish that goal. While not all rumors turn out to be true, the ones which bring bad news generally are. There is now even more reason to be employed in the shops that are essential to the German war effort. Though no one wishes to help the Germans, if this is the only way to save oneself, and must be done. On this said note, I send you my love, your devoted future Papa. So that's that letter from 1941. Now, I will open it to questions now. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
If you'll just raise your hand, I'll bring you a mic if somebody wants to ask a question. Yeah.
How do you think this experience changed you in any way?
I learned what being frightened is, what being scared is, and I learned what kindness means when somebody is kind to somebody else. So, and I guess that has stayed with me, you know. I learned that people are human beings, that whoever they are, they're worthy of living a life through. The Germans had a word for the Jews and the Eastern Slavs. In German, it's called Untermenschen. Untermenschen is subhuman. They were called subhuman. In other words, they took a whole segment of population and called them subhuman. Now, there's no such thing, obviously, as subhuman, because we are all the same, really. Physically and mentally and, you know, in all respects, we're all human beings. They've separated those people, particularly the Jewish people, which made it easier for them to get rid of them. In other words, it was no crime for anybody, you know, to kill a Jew at will. And, well, a lot of ways it changed me that I probably cannot detect and I'm not aware of. But I'm aware of the fact that every human being has worth and has value, and it should not be looked down upon. And it doesn't apply just to certain races, ethnic groups, racial groups, or whatever. It applies even to silly things like bullying in school. When there is a child that may be either handicapped or not exactly the way, maybe not attractive, and then there's someone that bullies them, and that's just a beginning. That's the kind of thing that I'm aware of, and I think is not right. I don't know if that answers your question. It's probably a long answer. Does it? Anybody else?
Did you elude capture by the Nazis?
I'm sorry?
Were you able to elude capture by the Nazis
Yes,
the entire time?
that story is in the book. You know, we were extremely lucky. You know, we did not wind up going to the camp. We were separated from my father. My father was a physician, and he was in the Polish Army. He was an officer in the Polish Army. So when the war broke out, he was recalled because he was in the reserves. And as the Germans were advancing, his unit was escaping to the east, and he wound up in Romania, in Bucharest, Romania, and where he stayed for up until 1945, and we were separated from him for 5 years. But while there, he managed to get some forged Chilean passports for us. So when he sent us copies of them, that's a fairly long story, which if you get the book, you will. It's an interesting story as to how he did it, because we have actually scammed and fooled the Nazis, if that's possible. It was an obvious forgery, but it was so well done that we evaded them, and we managed. So what they did is they interned us as enemy aliens. You know, they had camps for British and American citizens, well, first in Germany and then in France, and we were sent to those camps, but that was under the protection of the International Red Cross, so we were safe. We were getting weekly parcels from the Red Cross with cigarettes and all kinds of, you know, food stuff, and I learned what corned beef was and what Spam was and so forth. So that's how we evaded. And we were liberated by the Americans in Vittel, France on September 10th, 1944.
Did you have any siblings that were taken with you into the camps?
I have one brother who came here. He was a PhD from MIT. He was a physicist and a mathematician. He was the only brother. I had cousins and close cousins that wound up. I had a cousin Gustav and a little Sarah who was 6 years old, and my grandmother, whom we left behind in the ghetto when we were interned, and they went to Auschwitz. And then we have other uncles. I had 2 uncles. I had a lot of other family members that had been gassed and annihilated. Why don't you stand up when you want to speak, and then Alyssa will be able to see who wants to. Anybody else?
Don't be shy, guys. This is a great opportunity and privilege to ask a question. There's no
I
wrong
can
question
talk
to ask.
some more if you don't have any questions.
There's a
but
question
that's-
right over there.
And when you were in Poland, was there anyone who was a Nazi but tried to necessarily help you? But they were, because I know anti-Semitism was part of Nazism, but there were any sympathizers among
Among the Germans?
Yeah.
Or Poles? Among the Germans? We found some people that were kind to us. And, you know, I remember certain incidents, you know, when we were first taken out of the ghetto with our papers to be sent to the camps, we were arrested by a policeman. A German policeman came along to take us, and he took us on a streetcar. He was going to escort us all the way to this camp in Germany. And when we got on the streetcar and we were traveling, we still had the stars off. He looked at it, at the star with disdain and says, "Take that crap off," he said. So I kind of knew that he had some feelings about it. But generally, you know, we didn't have that much contact with the Germans. Most of the contact was very, you know, negative, you know. They were not kind to you. Then, of course, there were some Germans that were guarding the camp, but they were dealing with mostly with British American citizens and you know, foreign nationals who were under the protection of the International Red Cross. So there was kind of a détente. There was the hostility was not visible, you know, and they enjoyed their service because they didn't have to go to the Eastern Front, which was Russia, which was probably the worst place that they would send German soldiers to.
Where did you move to when you immigrated to America?
Where did I move to in America? Okay, it's not part of the Holocaust, but I'll tell you. I arrived in New York City, and I lived on the upper west side of New York City. That was actually there were very many people like myself who were survivors, and a lot of them were survivors of the camps, and they had a tattoo on their forearm, you know. So I hung around there, but then I went to I went to college. I went to Cooper Union in New York, and then I was drafted into the U.S. Army. After that, when I was discharged, I went to the University of Michigan to complete my studies, and I lived first in New York City, and then in Pound Ridge, New York, and now I live in Guilford, and at the end of next month, I'm moving to Maine. How's that? I'll be a Mainer, yeah. So,
I should stay in this back section. You guys have good questions.
So you were young when it like first started to happen. Did you really know what was like did you understand what was going on?
I understood even from before the war, because in those days you didn't have television, you had an old-fashioned radio. And I remember my father would sit at the radio on a little stool with his face cradled in his arms, listening to Hitler's speeches in German. Because my father was educated both in Poland and in Vienna, Austria, so he was fluent in German. And he listened to those speeches, and I didn't understand German except for one word, which was Schlagen. Because my parents spoke German among themselves when they didn't want us to understand what they're saying. And I didn't know any German except for one word, which is Schlagen, and that means spanking. So anyway, and he listened to it, and all I could hear was the barking sound of his voice. And all my father was saying, this was 1938, was saying to my mother, why don't we go to America he wanted just to immigrate, but he says, why don't we at least go to New York to the World's Fair? There was a World's Fair coming up, I think, 1940, so he wanted to go. But she refused to because her parents were living down the block and she didn't want to leave her family. That's how he got stuck there. So, and did I understand? Yes and no, because when you're 10 years old, you're still a kid. The war broke out, I had friends, and we did what kids do to the extent that we could, you know. I mean, I learned how to make a kite and fly a kite. I was interested. I did artwork. I like to paint and draw, and it was limited. We were limited to a certain area, but you tried to do that, and that interspersed with moments of absolute fright when the Germans would have a liquid, and they called action. They would come in the middle of the night to fill their quotas of people to deport to the death camps. And you'd hear the roaring of the trucks and the jack boots on the pavement, and screaming and yelling and cursing in German, and they're pulling out people out of their homes and loading them onto trucks and then transporting them to trains. So you hear that and you experience, I mean, it's something that I've never experienced before. You experience real fright. I mean, real, and fright of that kind affects your digestive system, your bowels. You feel like you're going to get diarrhea. So if there's a bad word about what happens when you're scared, it does happen, you know, when you're very frightened. So that's when you think of how it affected me, you know, that's something, an experience that you don't want to repeat it. But that was, you know, that transitory, because the next day you'd meet your friends and things would be apparently normal again, to the extent that they could be. All right. I got somebody over there.
Did you witness any resistance by the Jews?
Well, the resistance was mainly in Warsaw at the end of the liquidation of the ghetto. There was very, very little. Actually, there were a couple of young students that I knew. They were high school students. And they were arrested and sent to Auschwitz because they were suspected that they were plotting something against the Germans. And the unfortunate thing, and that was really unfortunate, is that they were, you know, the Germans organized the Jewish militia, you know. They had people, you know, among the Jews picked out who would, you know, act as policemen locally. And they assisted actually in rounding up the Jews, because they felt, just like the heads of the Jewish community who were appointed by the Germans, they felt that by doing that, they would be the last ones to go, or maybe they would save themselves. And they did it at the expense of everybody else. And that was kind of a, you know, I don't know if you ever heard the expression quisling. Quisling was a Norwegian, you know, prime minister who collaborated with the Nazis and became a word accepted in the English language. So they were quislings, and some of them behaved terribly. Some of them were helpful. And the long and short of it was that they still went to Auschwitz. As a matter of fact, the head of the community and all his cohorts, the only thing they got for their service to the Germans, instead of going in a cattle car, they were driven to Auschwitz in a squad car by the Germans. So, anyway, I don't know if that... anybody else?
So, when you were in a camp in France, was it?
Yes.
What were like specific conditions like for you, like sleeping and being with
All
your
right.
family and stuff?
Now, let me tell you, this was like going from hell to paradise, if there is such a metaphor that you can use, because the camp in France was a place called Vittel, V-I-T-T-E-L. And you looked it up on the internet, you'll see it's a spa. Before the war, it was a spa. And it had mineral waters, and it had a lot of big hotels. So we were housed, there were two sections. It was the American section and the British section. It was surrounded by barbed wire. And the two sections, there was a main road going through it. The two sections were joined by a bridge, an overhead bridge. And we had a hotel room. You know, we lived in a hotel room. They were serving some meals, which are not very good. We got all these packages, and we made our own food. So, and the main thing is we had a school. We were going to high school. And as a matter of fact, when we were in, the high school was actually run by American nuns. And they were terrific teachers, you know. We had absolute terrific school. And we were learning, you know, all the subjects that you'd learn right here. So it was like, it was, except for the fact that we could not leave, we were confined to the camp. But even there, the Germans got after us, because there was one group of Jews from Warsaw that came, a very, very large family, I think, maybe 100 of them, 120. All of them were named Rappaport, and they were related to a rabbi in Switzerland who got them all a Paraguayan citizenship. Again, Paraguayan citizenship. They were phony. And when they brought them there, you know, again, I described it in one of my letters. When they brought them there, these people were very Orthodox Jews, and they wore Orthodox clothes, and they had side curls and all the rest of it, beards. And I thought to myself, you know, they're really, you know, it's like poking a finger in a Nazi's eye. They could at least tone it down a little. And they were put in a little separate hotel. And then there was somebody, a quisling, like I told you, among the Jews who collaborated with the Germans. And he went to the commandant of the camp, and he told him that these people are not really Paraguayans. And a few weeks later, a couple of weeks later, a Gestapo commission came from Berlin to examine all the Jews with South American documents, and including my mother, you know. And they took, you know, they found out that this was not authentic. So they took a lot of these people, several hundred, not just them, but others that were in the camp, and sent them to a transit camp in Drancy, and eventually they went to Auschwitz. And we just escaped it, because when they called my mother in, and they investigated and asked her, and she just played dumb. She says, "I'm not Chilean, it's my husband, you know, I have nothing to do with it." And they let her go. That was it. So it was good and bad. There were some bad experiences, and they took people out of there and sent them to the death camps.
Quislings, the Jews that were helping, the ones that survived, were they ever brought up on war crimes?
I really don't know of any. You know, this was not an overt thing, but it was more, how should I say, not covert. It was kind of suspected. I don't know if you could really prove it, because you could see them fraternize with the Germans and talk to them, and then the word got, well, he's the one that was the one that told these stories. So I don't know of any incidents where collaborating Jews, which there were few and far between, obviously. But, and they were not doing it because of idealism. They just wanted to save themselves, you know. There's somebody there.
How aware were you of like the outside world from the war and other countries who were trying to help?
Were we aware of it? Yeah, we had kind of an underground railroad and radio. Some people, you were not allowed to have a radio, but people would listen to it and hear it. And especially when we were, not so much when we were in, well, of course, when we were in Poland, still in the ghetto, the Germans, you know, were really making fantastic progress. They were up in Leningrad, and they were up at the gates of Moscow, and they were bombing the heck out of Great Britain. America has barely gotten into the war, and they were doing great in the Africa campaign. So we thought, my God, that the Germans were. But then when they got, I think when they got to Stalingrad, anybody ever hear of Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad? Okay, I think that was the turning point. Because it's the first time that, you know, and then, of course, Leningrad, which is St. Petersburg now, was besieged. And, I mean, people were starving, but they did not manage to get to it. But Stalingrad was the turning point. That was, I think, the late, I don't remember exact date, 42 or so, yeah. So, the question again was? Did I answer? I was
just kind of asking like how aware you were of other countries.
Yeah, all right. So when we were in the camp, we're not allowed to have radio. We had a French newspaper in German that they would deliver to us, and it shows us the position of where the Allies were, especially after the landing in Normandy. And I remember I had a map of Normandy and little pins, and I would stick them in and show the pins. So we had pretty good idea where the Allies were and what was happening. Not in detail. We're not flooded like CNN, you know. You know, we didn't have anything like that. We had to listen to the German news and kind of digest what they're saying and extract and try to get some of the truth out of it. And then some people would have a radio and rumors were going around, so you did get a pretty good idea where things were. Of course, when the D-Day came and the landing took place, that was the most fantastic thing. It was June 6, 1944, and we were not that far from there because we were liberated in Vittel on September 10th, 1944. So it was only 3 months later that the Allies advanced to there. Of course, the war didn't end till mid-1945, May 45. So, I hope that answered your question.
Did you know anyone that survived Auschwitz?
Oh, of course. Yeah, I had friends, you know, that when I lived on the Upper West Side, I had a very good friend. His name is Joe Matzner. He died recently. He was a very good friend, you know, when I lived on the Upper West Side. And the odd thing is I mentioned it to somebody. His name is Joseph Matzner. If anybody has a pencil and you want to write that down, you can go on YouTube and see his little story on YouTube that he describes before he died about the concentration camp and going from one concentration to another where they had these long walks in the winter. And it's really telling. I mean, so I had quite a few people that I knew. I don't anymore because, you see, I'm a child Holocaust survivor, and I'm getting close to 90. Most of the adults are gone now, you know. So, and this is why, you know, you get stories of Holocaust denial and so forth. They pretend it didn't happen or something like that, so that, you know, people who bear witness, actually, like myself, are fewer and fewer and far between.
After you were liberated, were you ever able to go back home to Poland and to your hometown?
Oh yes, again, that's in my book. Not only did I go back to Poland, because to make a long story short, how many of you have heard or listened to any of the, I know that some teachers got copies of the book. Have any of you heard some of these stories from your teachers? Yeah, show of hands? Okay, so not too many. Well, you know, all these questions that you're raising like that are in the book, because to make a long story short, we went from France to Palestine. That's before it became Israel, because my father went from Romania to Palestine, and we were there for a couple of years. But then we decided we never wanted to stay there. We wanted to come to America, my father and my whole family. So we didn't want to stay there, and the war was breaking out. So we wound up, long story short, we wound up in communist Poland behind the Iron Curtain and spent some time in jail and so forth. My brother and I, my father and mother stayed in Palestine, subsequently Israel. And so we were in Poland, and then another exciting story, we stowed away on a coal ship to Sweden. And then we stayed in Sweden for about 10 months, and from there we came to the United States. Answer your question, I hope. Anyway, like I said, these questions can be answered easily in the book, you know. Go ahead, anybody.
What's your how do you feel about those who deny the Holocaust?
About people, I just saw a very, very good film, a very new film, called Denial. I recommend any of you saw that, Denial? It's about a Holocaust denier from Britain who says that Hitler was not a bad man and so on and so forth. This is a true story. I think it was happening, in 2000 something or just before. And a woman named Deborah Lipstadt challenged him, and he sued her for libel in a British court. Very, very good movie, and tells you the whole stuff. How do I feel about it? Well, there are people that will always tell you that it's snowing while the sun is shining and there's sun out there. So, you know, and one of the questions was this in another session like this, which I haven't heard from you yet, but I'll tell you the question and give you my answer. And one of the students asked is, what could we do to prevent something like from happening again? Anyway, so here is my answer to that. First of all, things like that are happening not again, but happening all the time. You look around you look at the world, and you think of, go back to Africa, what happened, you know, in Rwanda, and what happens between the Hutu and Tutsi, what's happening in Syria. I mean, the cruelty of men toward other men is limitless. And I think that the most important thing for you as young people is to always seek out the truth. And don't listen to just one source of information. If you listen to a single source of information, if you believe that source of information, it may turn into propaganda. So when you listen to one source of information and you act on that, I think that's probably the biggest mistake you made. You're in a school, you're open to everything that's available to you in knowledge. So listen to different sides of every story, and then educate yourself, and then make up your own mind based on what you hear as to what the real facts are. Because all these things, you know, about, when you hear about people killing each other over things like my friend upstairs is better than your friend upstairs. And that's what it's all about, you know. They use religion as an excuse for one way or another. Anyway, that's my thought and theory about how to approach it, because you can't single-handedly go out and fight it and fight the Holocaust deniers, but the truth is there. It's in history, and you know, if you want to, you can go on YouTube and find all kinds of videos of emaciated, you know, people in camps and corpses lying in heaps, you know, and it's all happened, you know. You can't deny that. And it was done by other human beings, namely the Nazis. Yeah,
Well, what was it like when you were liberated?
Oh, what was it like? Here is I'll tell you a little incident, you know. The French had an underground, you know, FFE, the Force Française d'Intérieur. That's the internal French force. And the slang word or the common word for it was the Maquis. And, you know, they were very, quote unquote, brave. When the Germans started withdrawing, because withdrawal took time, you know, the Americans were advancing from Normandy toward us, going toward Germany, and you would see the camp commandant left the camp, I think, on the 1st of September. You know, he had an old Citroen, a French car which was painted olive drab, and I heard the engine all night long trying to start. It didn't work. It turned out that the Maquis had put some sugar in his gas tank. So eventually he disappeared, and the car disappeared. And then the Maquis, the French, came outside the camp, set up a huge machine gun, you know, on the corner, and they manned the machine gun, and everybody applauded and everything. And then they heard that there are more Germans withdrawing, and the machine gun disappeared. So every time the Germans, they thought, totally withdrew, the machine gun was there. When there were more Germans withdrawing, the machine gun disappeared. Well, on the 10th of September, it was 10 days after the commandant left, you know, I set sight for the first time on an American Jeep. The Jeep drove through the street outside, and we saw Americans for the first time, to huge applause from everybody that was behind the barbed wire. And then we saw a couple of American GIs with rifles, you know, and bayonets, and a troop of German soldiers that were running, you know, and I mean, in lockstep, you know, jogging in front of them as prisoners. And one of them was minus his pants. You know, obviously, evidently he was trying to change into civilian clothes when he got trapped. So he was running there without his pants, with a long shirt down. And again, huge applause and laughter. So that's one of the incidents I remember clearly. And that was on the 10th of September. On the next day, the French General Leclerc marched in dress uniform with a whole battalion of French troops in dress uniform, with a band and so forth. Exactly 50 years later, my late wife Betty and I went to Europe, and we decided to go to Vittel on the 50th anniversary of the liberation. And we got to Vittel, and I see placards all over. 50th anniversary, September 11th. I said, wait a minute, you know. The Americans were on the 10th. So I went to the mayor's office, you know, and said, I wanted a copy of that. I have a copy of it, and a copy of that poster is in my book also. And I asked them, how come it's the 11th? It was the 10th. Oh, no, and this lady said, I was here. I said, so was I, you know. And she said, no, it was. I said, yes, I remember that. On the 11th, the General Leclerc came in, but on the 10th, the first American Jeep came in. That was the real liberation. But that's French. That's why I say that chauvinism is a French word, anyway. Anything else? By the way, those are the lighter notes of my story, but go on.
What's your opinion on the American climate, political climate today, considering what you've been through?
Don't let me start it. I'll tell you, I actually posted on my Facebook page. It was earlier this year, you know, when there was all this thing about not letting in Muslims and so forth. What I posted, I got a picture of a whole bunch of children, and that's again from the 40s. A bunch of children, a picture of a bunch of children with these stars on them. And I took a similar picture of kids, of Muslim kids with little turbans, you know, and girls with this. And I photoshopped little, what do you call it, the crescent, star and crescent onto their fall, and just put it there with no words, you know. So that's my view of it, you know. I mean, Muslim or anything else, and it's unfortunately, says, well, I'm a, you know, you can probably understand, I'm a sworn progressive, you know. I don't want to use labels. I'm an independent, but I'm sworn progressive for the reasons that I stated and because of my past, because I know that some of the conservative ideas, you know, unfortunately, tend to discriminate between different groups, and discrimination of any kind is not only bad, it's evil, you know. We're all human beings. And you know, I can look at it this way. You know, it's the difference of what you are and who you are. What you are is an accident of birth. I could have been born, you know, black or brown or you know, a Catholic or whatever, and that's what I was born. But who you are is who you become, who you determine by your own actions, the propensities of you by your own morality. So it's a difference between what you are and who you are. Okay. I know I'm drifting off from your questions, but I'm just rambling on, so.
As Japan was allied with Germany during the war and fighting against America, did you ever hear or see any influence of the Japanese during the war?
Well, there was very little. We knew very, very little over the U.S.-Japanese war when we were in, you know, we were too absorbed and concerned with it. We all wanted America to join the fight. And there was a big celebration when we heard that America joined it, but we never really heard much about the war between the U.S. and Japan. It was just too remote and was not immediate to our own concerns, you know, in the ghettos. So, I mean, that's another kind of a blemish. Because, you know, I keep saying in all these meetings that I have that, you know, having come here was the best thing I did in my life. And despite everything I said, I think this is really the greatest country in the world. There's no other country like it. I'm proud of it. I'm proud to be an American. And, you know, I think of my little grandkids, you know, Oscar and Emma, you know, who live in Casco and in a local school there. And I think of them, he says, nobody would ever think that they are, you know, grandkids of a Holocaust survivor. They're just like everybody else. And me, after being here, living here for so many years, I don't think of myself as being anything other than American. There's no other country that'll accept you this way. No other country. You come here, and it's by choice, obviously, because you can stay within your own enclave and community and whatnot. But by choice, you know, you can be an American overnight. I mean, I'm told I still have a trace of an accent, but you know, I still pride myself in speaking better English and using better English than our president currently. Anyway, well, I thought I'd get a chuckle out of somebody. I'm sorry. Anyway, And I didn't use the word tremendous once.
Did you ever hold any hatred for Germans? And if so, did you ever forgive them?
Oh, that's a good question, because when I graduated at the University of Michigan, I was awarded a traveling fellowship to Europe. So I went to Europe, and just as an aside, I was 5 months in Europe. I had to study some architectural finishes. That was my thesis. I spent 5 weeks in Paris and bought an MG, and then drove about 12,000 miles around Europe. When I got to Germany, I still felt, when I heard the German language there, it really was like, like pins going into me. I felt so bad. I drove right through. I did even something very naughty, because I was with a friend, and we stopped at the rooming house, just one overnight. And the lady, was so nasty to us, the landlady, and reminded me of everything, that they did. So before I left, I took a small towel and flushed it down the toilet. And then I drove very quickly, went into Denmark. So, anyway, they prefer the fun parts, So much for the Holocaust. Yeah.
Do you have any regrets?
About the towel? Not at all about the towel. No, what regrets did you have? Yeah.
No, like about your life, like if you could go back, would you change anything?
Well, I wish my father had taken us to the World's Fair. Do I have regrets? Everybody has regrets. I would have done other things. There's a story in my book. Again, I think you ought to read it, because a lot of the questions. One of the biggest regrets I have is when we were leaving Palestine. We were going to essentially go to Germany to spend time with our aunt. We had a distant aunt in Germany who would, while we were waiting to get to the United States, because in those days, they had quotas for different nationalities for immigration. So we were on the Polish quota, and the waiting time on the Polish quota to get in was 5 years. So we couldn't get in immediately. We were waiting for a visa. So my parents said, well, go to Europe, and go to Munich, where Aunt Regina is, and you can stay there with her until the quota comes up and you go to America. And incidentally, war was just breaking up in Israel between Israel, Palestine and the Arab countries. And my parents, and nor did we didn't want to be in another war. So we just felt that we're not going to stay there, and we didn't want to fight there. So anyway, I went to get a Polish passport in Tel Aviv. I went to the Polish consulate to get a Polish passport. And they told me, and my parents gave me some money to buy the passports. And they told me that, what kind of passport do you want? Do you want one for return to Poland, which is £5, or one that is valid for travel around, which is £10? And that was for both my brother and I, so that we do twice that. And I know that my parents were very, short of cash. My father was working, but still, I was as frugal then as I am now. So I said, well, I hate to spend extra money, so I'll just get the one for return to Poland. I figured on the way we'll just stop in Germany. And so, make a long story short, that's probably the biggest regret that I have in every story that I told there, because I say, avoiding the cracks. That's the biggest crack I stepped on in that case, because what happened, because of that, we wound up behind the Iron Curtain in Poland. We could have gone to Belgium, we could have gone anywhere if we had the valid passport. So, but for saving the £5 per You know, we wound up for a year behind the Iron Curtain. Well, it happens that we're getting close to. Yeah. Well, listen, thank you for your interest, and I think we're...
I wanted to show you, this is a copy that Mr. Horowitz has referenced several times. It's his story. It's entitled Avoiding the Cracks, and let me just read one paragraph. The title of my narrative comes from a ritual I engaged in while in the ghetto at the height of deportation of Jews in Auschwitz between 1942 and 1943. Whenever I ran to or from home, I never walked at that age. I tried to avoid the cracks in the pavement, convincing myself that no harm would come to us if I didn't step on them, and that this would help us survive the war. That's what gave him the title of the book. I highly recommend it. I've read it a couple of times now, and I've heard Mr. Horowitz's story, and I have to tell you, I've learned so much from you, but I love today, I haven't heard you say there's a difference between what you are and who you are. That's very powerful. There's a difference between what you are and who you are. You control who you are. And I hope you walk away being changed by the hour that you had the privilege of listening to Mr. Horowitz today. Will you please join me in thanking him for his time?
Thank you very much for your attention. And just one thing as a parting